Okay, welcome back. We are now in AP Senior English, and we are working with an introduction to Aristotle's Poetics, as well as Oedipus Rex. Tomorrow you will take a reading assessment over Oedipus Rex, and you're reading from the Brownwood textbook. My objective today is to introduce you to the primary elements of Aristotelian poetics, okay? So this is kind of where we began. When we look at the Greeks and their philosophers, we immediately are met with what we often will refer to as the Holy Trinity of Greek philosophers. Go ahead and jot down those three names to see if you can do that on your own. Who are those three people? And you get extra Scooby snacks if you do it in order, as you should be able to do it in order. For those of you who are new to these kinds of questions, don't worry, we will answer it. But we begin with what old fart, who never, according to our knowledge anyway, ever wrote anything down? Socrates is the first in that Holy Trinity. Socrates is the first in that Holy Trinity. Followed by who? He has a student named Plato. That's right. Now that's not what you played with as a child. This is Plato, right? And then finally, Plato had a student named Aristotle. That's correct. So the Holy Trinity, as we often refer to it, is Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. When we are working with then those three names, we are really assuming much of what we will study now for the next 4 weeks, all right? So I'm giving you a bit of context here for our study. After our looking at the three epic poems, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, we now will take a break. So understand, okay? We now will take a break, and we will step away from our analysis of the epic poems, and we will then move to a study of some Greek philosophers. Those philosophers, however, we will not study in order. We're not going to study Socrates, Plato first. We're actually going to look specifically at the third of those three guys, Aristotle. And as sad as it is, this will be one of our only times that we will look closely at the work of Aristotle. Many will argue that Aristotle is far more important than Socrates and Plato as thinkers because his range of knowledge, that classic word is ken, K-E-N, his range of knowledge is prodigious. Aristotle is in many ways the inventor of most of the systems of knowledge at the university today. Let's just make a quick list of all the things Aristotle is responsible for. It's mind-boggling what this cat was able to do in one lifetime. He, for example, will study and will classify biological systems. When you study with Miss Barnes in biology and you have to do those classification systems, Aristotle actually is the one who invents those systems. He's the great, I'm going to use a word here that you're probably familiar with if you study biology at all. He's the great taxonomer. What do I mean by taxonomies? Do you know that word? What is a taxonomy? Yeah, it's classifications, isn't it, right? Those systems of classification, Aristotle is responsible for that. He's responsible for the invention. He invents logic in the Western tradition. He writes a very important treatise on logic that will be up through the Middle Ages. You still have to study Aristotle's logic if you're going to be any kind of reputable scholar. In many ways, he will invent other kinds of disciplines like sociology, psychology, zoology. I mean, it's just an amazing thing. You could argue he's the earliest thinker of anthropology. He even kind of gestures towards thinking about archaeology. I'm not kidding when I say this guy's knowledge base is prodigious. Of course, that would make sense. He studied with Plato for 30 years. So, I mean, right away, we're going to see that Aristotle has good upbringing. He will invent the university system, the Lyceum, and in many ways, he will formalize the education and knowledge that will later become the way we think about school in Europe and then ultimately the United States. You cannot overestimate this guy's effect and influence. Today, however, we're going to study specifically one thing that he looked at and he wrote about. And this is his theory of aesthetics. Now, he didn't invent this technically he didn't invent any of those other things other than you could argue maybe logic. But aesthetic theory of or related to the appreciation of art. It is Aristotle who will give us his understanding of this project in his classic essay, Poetics. Now, while you would hear that term, poetics, and maybe assume that his essay is about poetry, the truth of the matter is it's really about what we today would call drama. And I'm not talking about middle school, 8th grade drama. I'm not talking about drama in that language. I mean here, when I say drama, I mean the theater. Okay, the theater. So let's get to business now, specifically about Aristotelian views. But I'm actually not going to begin with Aristotle. I'm going to begin rather with modern day. You know this to be the case. Every year in Hollywood, California, all of the rich and powerful dress up in the most exquisite of garments and all arrive in those really long stretch limousines to walk down that red carpet to come inside of one room where all of the most creative and the most powerful, and dare we say it, the most wealthy people on this planet all congregate for what we call the Academy Awards. If you know anything about the Academy Awards, you know that of all of the thousands of films that are made every year, a small number of those films will be collected as considered the best. And then some individual at the very end of the night will come up in front of that group of people. The average IQ in that room is easily up over 135. I mean, these are really bright people who do this kind of work. And one person comes in front of all those people and says, the best picture of the year is, and then we'll name that picture. At no point, and I've watched for a few years these Academy Awards hoping I would see what I'm about to say, but it's never happened. It probably never will happen. At no point does one person stand up out of the audience and say, whoa, wait a minute. You can't name one picture the best picture of the year because movies are art. How can you even talk about art as being one better than another? I mean, it's all a matter of taste. For example, the year that Dumb and Dumber, that film, was released, it outsold the Academy Award-winning film 10-1 in the box office. Right? And you're probably familiar with films that have been voted Best Picture of the Year that you started watching and then you went, dude, I can't even get through a wretched film like this. What is going on? Nobody stands up and says that. Now, wait a minute. This is a really important observation, so stay with me. The very notion, the very idea that we could somehow quantify and classify art as some of it being better than others, where do we even get an idea like that? Because, I mean, technically speaking, it's really difficult to ever talk about what's good and what's bad in art. It's all a matter of taste. So where do we get the idea of the Academy Awards? I mean, who gives anyone the right, or a group of people, notice it's called the Academy of Voters, who gives this group of people the right to determine what's the best movie of the year? How do they even get that notion of there being one film that's the best film, right? The answer, by the way, to that is Aristotle. Aristotle is the inventor of this idea. He's so powerful in his instantiation of this idea that it stays with us right up to the present day. And what's even interesting, I mean, I gave this lecture once and a student actually said it out loud. Well, I've never thought about that, but you're actually right. That is true. I mean, really? Who would even think to try to say one movie was actually better than all the other films? And that's exactly what the Academy Awards night is. The argument that one film sits preeminent to all of the others. To get that little tiny statue is a huge deal if you make the movie, because you've been told your film was the best one of the year. But that project, like, who would even think that project is legitimate? The answer is all those people sitting in that room.
And Titanic was the best.
And why is it that certain films are given that award as opposed to others? That is a very thorny question. Now, I'm so pleased that Mr. Schreiber was able to mention what for some of us continues to be, for the Academy debate, one of the thorn in the side questions, and that is, of course, James Cameron's classic film, Titanic. Now, we got to talk about Titanic. By the way, I'm not interested in whether you like the film or not. Remember, aesthetic theory is not about what you like. Aesthetic theory is about what you appreciate. So let's make that distinction. But we've got to answer this question. How do you account for the fact? Now, I'll ask the question and I'll try and answer it. How do you account for the fact that this film called Titanic, this 3-hour-long film, which can be reduced easily to a single line, the boat sinks, that this film, right, this 3-hour film, 3 weeks into this film, all of our research was telling us that the number of ticket sales required that fully 1/3 of the people who had seen that film in the first 3 weeks went back to see it again. That is truly remarkable. It begs an intriguing question. What, like the plot line was so complex you didn't get it the first time? You got to go back and watch it all over? No. The people who go back to see it report, no, we understood it the first time. Well then, dude, why do you got to go back to watch it all over again? Let's point out something. Hollywood is first and foremost about making bank, and they want to do a lot of that. So anytime a film is successful, trust me, there are really bright people sitting in rooms trying to figure out what made this film successful so that we can duplicate it again and again. That's called Hollywood. That's their whole project. Trust me, there was a whole lot of discussion and debate about the success of this film and why it was so successful. How can you account for the fact that so many people went back to see that film a second time, and even, remarkably, a third time in the first 5 weeks of this film's performance in the theater? Now, I've got to make sure I'm not dating myself, or at least I have some sense of it. Were you guys of age to see that film in the theaters? Okay, see, I'm now lecturing, and this has been the case for a number of years for me, where I'm lecturing this film now, and you saw it, if you saw it at all, dare I say endured it, by virtue of watching it on DVD or something. You didn't get to see it in theaters. I'll tell you a little about this, and I'm so grateful that Mr. Schreiber took us in this direction, because this is a really key part of our lecture. Fully 2 years before this film was released, already you were hearing in the media things about this film. For example, if you were in Japan, they are huge Leonardo fans over there. Already 2 years before that movie was released, there was already talk about this film, and it's coming out. What's interesting is that the major people involved in the film, including the actors and of course James Cameron, the guy who wrote and directed the film, already were making private statements out loud about the fact they worried that this film was going to flop, completely flop, as in there would not be even the amount of monies made to pay back the creating of the film. No one had any idea this film was going to do as well as it did, of course, the all-time grossing film. No one had any idea about that. Then the film is released. It actually was released on opening night, even in Worland, which tells you the number of the number of theaters in America that simultaneously were showing this film, and I should say, of course, worldwide. It was a worldwide phenomenon. People were seeing this film all over the world in that first week. I intentionally didn't go. I was interested as a sociologist. I was very interested in the hype of this film was prodigious, but I was very interested in how students would respond to the film. And so for the first couple of days, I had students who had gone to the film, and I was asking them, what was it like? Two things they kept saying, and this is fascinating to me, and you can jot these down in your notes because we're going to come back to try to explain why. They said two things about the film. One, even though it was 3 hours long, they said, it didn't seem that long. It seemed like it was a really fast film. And again, these people were watching it in the theater. And two, they felt tired at the end of the film. I said, what do you mean tired? And they said, several of my students said this, it was really weird last night. The film, by the way, for the first 16 showings of that film, that's fully 2 weeks, every time that film was shown in Worland, it was sold out. Okay, this is a phenomenon. Again, I don't think Worland is somehow particularly special, and we know that statistically it wasn't. That film was selling out in every theater it was showing in for weeks after its release. But my students said the following, several of them. It was really weird. The film ended, 3-hour film, the boat sinks. The film ended, and everyone kept sitting. during the credits. You know how most people just kind of get up and leave? My students said it was really weird. Lots and lots of people just kept sitting at the end of the movie when the credits start rolling. And then when people got up, several of my students said, and we walked outside, there were people just kind of standing, like in the foyer, or standing like outside. Now, it was a long film, so for example, if it started at 7, it ended at 10 at night, which would make sense that especially kids who went to it would like bugger on home, homework or whatever. She said, lots of my students were saying things like, that we were all just kind of standing around. It was really weird. It was like you didn't know what to say, but you kind of just stood there. And then, you know, people like kind of slowly go to your... And several of my students said, I went home and just kind of sat in my room for a long time. Like, man, that was like some kind of film. A film about the boat saying. Now, let's point something out. Aristotle is going to give us an answer to why. That nobody else can answer this question. By the way, the debates about why this film was so successful are problematic. For example, nothing Leonardo DiCaprio made after that film came anywhere close to that, along with Kate Winslet. And both of them have said out loud that before the film was released, they did not think that it would have that level of phenom. It completely changed their lives. Both of them have said out loud that film completely changed their life in terms of the fame that they acquired because of that film. James Cameron, of course, went on to make other films. None of them had the kind of phenom success that Titanic had. Other films have tried to imitate and emulate, but none of them have had the success. By the way, I'm not just talking, I'm not just talking about economic success. I'm talking about a film, and by the way, what I just said about people saying I felt tired and I just kind of stood around and it kind of stuck in my brain, that was said by lots of people. Social scientists were immediately studying this phenomenon because historical movies about events that actually happened, lots of those films get made. None of them had the kind of success. Question, why? By the way, there aren't very many ways to answer this question authentically if you don't take into consideration Aristotle. No kidding. Aristotle will be able to say to us, I can tell you why. Now, I find that remarkable. Because we're now looking at a guy who lives 500 years before the birth of Christ. He writes a little treatise called Poetics. We don't even have the full treatise anymore. As a matter of fact, the last full edition of this text was in the Library at Alexandria. By the way, if you're national, treasure fans, you know that in the very final scene of that film, when they discover the treasure, that the woman who is, I think, kind of a specialist in these areas of antiquity, she looks at some scrolls and she makes an observation that these are scrolls from the Library at Alexandria. Of course, that doesn't mean anything to you unless you realize the Library of Alexandria was the first Library of Congress. It was the first greatest library. And it went up in toast in a matter of literal minutes because everything was by pyrite, that is to say paper. And it caught fire. The entire library goes torch. And so the last full holding of Poetics was actually there. And so all we have today is only half of this classic essay, the half on tragedy. We don't know what Aristotle had to say about comedy. That was apparently the other side of the and we don't know what he had to say about it, other than what we can deduce. For example, Aristotle had a definite bias for tragedy against comedy. It's a fair question to ask, why, in the year that that other film won, if Dumb and Dumber outsold it 10-1 in the theaters, why wouldn't a comedy be given some serious consideration for Best Picture of the Year? Some of you are now starting to think, who watch movies, which I think are a lot of you, if you'll think about it, the films that win Academy Award Best Picture of the Year rarely are a comedy. They're usually dramas. That is to say, they're films that have all this high action and sadness and all that kind of stuff. They're dramas. They're not comedies. Why? Why is it that, for example, the Academy has such a bias against comedy? The answer to that is Aristotle. And the reason is because of what Aristotle said about tragedy. Now I'm ready to go to work with you. I'm going to outline now very briefly for you what Aristotle had to say about tragedy and drama. Now, the way he does this is really circular in his logic. That's funny given that he invents logic and all of that, but let's point this out. What does Aristotle do? Well, he wants to classify or to quantify what is the greatest single play of all time. Okay? And what he does is he looks around at all of the plays and he decides on one play. That play is the play named Oedipus Rex. Rex just simply means king, so King Oedipus. Okay? That play is, of course, one of the plays of the great dramatic writer Sophocles. Now, we don't want to confuse Socrates with Sophocles. Socrates is the great philosopher. Sophocles is the great dramatic writer. Sophocles had written a trilogy. Okay, a trilogy. That is to say, he had a collection of 3 plays that are to be seen as kind of a unit. The first of those 3 plays is what we call Oedipus Rex. The second of those 3 plays is what we call Oedipus at Colonus. And the third of those 3 plays we call Antigone. Okay? Taken collectively, this is considered often Sophocles' greatest offering. Okay? So we've got 3 of them. Aristotle would argue that of the 3, Oedipus Rex is the single greatest of those 3 plays. And then he went on to argue it's actually the best play ever written. And then he said the reason it's the best play ever written is A, B, C, D, E. And he made these reasons why. Those reasons why are the primary elements of Poetics, this little essay that he would write. Now, Mr. Kelleher, note the circular logic here. What makes it so important that in a play you have A, B, C, D, E? Because that's what happens in Oedipus Rex. Well, what makes Oedipus Rex so important? Oh, because that's the most important play. Well, what makes that such an important play? Because it does these 3 or 4 things, A, B, C, D, E. Well, what makes that so important? Well, because that's what Oedipus Rex does, and that's the most important. See the circular logic? Okay, it's a derived, it's an assumed kind of argument. But, be that as it may, we're going to find some compelling lines of reasoning and argument for the remarkable mind of Aristotle. By the way, we will call this the Aristotelian critique of drama. The Aristotelian critique of drama. And I will tell you in advance, after we've worked through this intel, many of my students have said, dude, I never can watch a movie the same way again. Guess what? You're probably going to think the same. Because from this point on, you're going to find yourself thinking with Aristotle's rubric. Well, what is that rubric? Well, let's go to the board and we'll work on it. The first thing that he says is, when you watch a tragedy, the most important thing to pay attention to is what he calls the protagonist. Okay? The protagonist. Now, the word pro, of course, carries with it some importance, right?
We're on.
We're leaving for golf.
Protagonist, okay? So, when we're talking, oh, good luck. When we're talking about protagonist, go ahead and define in your notes real quickly who and what that is. What is a protagonist? The protagonist is the character with whom the audience most identifies. The protagonist is the character with whom the audience most identifies. Okay? By the way, what's the opposite of the protagonist? The antagonist. Yes, the antagonist. That character with whom the audience least identifies. The protagonist is the character with which the audience most identifies. But whoa, wait. What do you mean by the word identifies? Well, that's a very interesting question. What does Aristotle mean? Well, Aristotle has a remarkable observation. Let's say it this way. You go to a performance, for example, of our drama department. Let's just say that they're putting on this presentation in the little theater. So there you go. You walk into the theater, you sit down. The lights go down. You're watching this performance on stage. If I were to ask you, where is the play taking place? You would look at me and say, what are you, crazy or something? Of course, everyone knows the play is taking place up on the stage. That's what drama is all about. Aristotle will say something quite remarkable. He will say, you totally miss it. You totally miss it. What? What do you mean you totally miss it? This is what Aristotle says. The real drama is not what's happening on stage at all. The real drama is what's happening in the audience. As the audience sits and watches the performance on stage. That's where the real drama takes place. His word picture for this will be picked up by Shakespeare in the play Hamlet, and it's a remarkable one.
Shakespeare will have Hamlet actually say that what good drama does is it's like a mirror that gets held up. And the audience is watching the performance, i.e. the mirror, and they actually see reflected right back their own ideas, their own views. Aristotle will invent this idea, and he will say the performance is a way to elicit a certain kind of response. Okay, now what is that response? Well, he says that response is important. That response is an identification with the protagonist. But what about the protagonist? What is it specifically that we define this protagonist in regards to tragedy? And the answer is the protagonist must begin high and end low. What we will call the fall of the protagonist. The fall of the protagonist. And that is crucial. There must be a fall. Okay? What he called what? What's the Greek word for this? What's the Greek word for the fall?
Treasure.
No, Greek word. Greek word starts with an H for us.
Hamartia.
The hamartia. Yes, the hamartia. So the hamartia is the tragic fall. Okay? When the protagonist falls, remember the protagonist is who the audience most identifies with. When the protagonist falls, there is a certain kind of response from that fall. What is that response by the audience? Well, two things. Okay? The first is fear. The second is pity. Okay? The first is fear. The second is pity. Now, Aristotle will say, this doesn't make a lot of sense in the abstract, but we can flesh it out if we study a single play. How about let's study Oedipus Rex? Through the experience in the audience's mind of participating in fear and pity, there is this thing called catharsis. Sometimes we'll call it purgation. Okay? What is to purge? To release, right? To release. Okay? Catharsis, a release. Okay? Where does Aristotle go to talk about this? Well, to the greatest play maybe ever written. Aristotle said so. It's the play Oedipus Rex. Let's outline it quickly. It is not unusual in Greek mythology that you will have a king who will have a son who will then be told, you have to kill him. Remember, this sounds very familiar to the Troy tale, does it not? And of course, King Priam in the city of Troy in Paris. Only this time we're not in the city of Troy. This time we're in the city of Thebes, which is a great Greek city. And the king, his name is Laius, and his beautiful wife, Jacusta, have a child. And Tiresias, the blind prophet, will come in and he will say, uh-oh, if you don't kill that kid, he's going to grow up, he's going to kill you, the father, he's going to marry your wife, his mother, Jacusta, he'll have 4 children. Uh-oh, got to kill the kid. But it's often the case, dads can't kill their sons, and so they'll do the second best thing. They'll try to somehow distance themselves, and this is what happens. Oedipus, as an infant, is taken out onto the mountain. He's left, his little feet are bound. The word Oedipus actually will mean of the swollen foot, because his feet swell because of the being bound by the leather thong, to die. Oedipus doesn't die. He's picked up by a shepherd from a nearby town called Corinth. And that shepherd raises Oedipus as his own child. Oedipus never knows that he's a foundling. He's never told that he was found. The parents of the shepherds, they want to just raise him. But in Greek mythology, when you grow up the son of a king, just like Paris, you grow up to look big and strong and Brad Pitt looking. And sure enough, he's a stunning, stunning young kid at 18. He's at a party because he loves to have a good time. He bumps into an old blind prophet who immediately recoils from him and goes, oh, you're cursed. Oedipus is like, dude, what do you mean I'm cursed? I can get any woman I want. What do you No, he says, you are cursed. You're going to kill your dad, marry your mom, and have children with her. Oedipus is like, gross. We should point out, to the Greeks, incest is a taboo. go a few thousand miles south from the Greeks to the land of Egypt, and of course it's completely the opposite, as we know, right? The Egyptians enjoyed that notion of trying to keep the gene pool all in one room, if you will, right? Okay, yeah, right.
Tiresias is partying with the kids.
It's not Tiresias who actually tells him. It's a different prophet who has the ability of foresight. And he says, uh-oh, this is bad news. So Oedipus does the one thing that makes sense to him. He says, dude, I don't want to kill my dad and marry my mom. That's gross. I'm just going to run away. So that's what he does. So out to the famous place that we call in Greek mythology the crossroads. Not unlike this area back behind the high school where you have two roads that intersect. Oedipus sees the old man driving his chariot like a bat out of Hades. And the old man's like, get out of the road. And Oedipus is like, up yours, I ain't getting out of nothing, you get up. Right? They both have a bad temper. Apple doesn't fall very far from the tree. And the old man's like, I'm going to jack you up. And Oedipus is like, bring it on. On the back of the chariot is a young servant, and he sees what's about to happen. This old man's about to have a fight with this young kid. He runs away and watches from the trees, and guess what he gets to see? Those two guys go at it. And Oedipus is having a crummy day already, and then all of a sudden he jacks this old man, and the old man don't breathe no more. He kills the old man. But, I mean, he figures, hey, the dude got what he deserved. He shouldn't have jacked with me. I was just walking down the road. Oedipus walks a few more miles down the road, and sitting there at the crossroads is a large monster called a Sphinx. It's got the head of a, what? Like a lion, and the body of like a lizard or something like that, you see. And it's a scary monster. Now, the portrayal of the Sphinx is different depending on the stories. It sometimes has wings, it's got a big beak, it's brutal. What it's doing is it's plaguing the city of Thebes because nobody can answer its riddle. And so it says to Oedipus, if you can answer the riddle of the Sphinx, then I'll leave and Thebes will be free. Well, Oedipus is like, all right, dude, what is it? I like riddles. And he says, okay, I'll ask you the question, but if you can't get it, I kill you. Oedipus is like, all right, I got to die sooner or later anyway. The question is a famous question. We call it the riddle of the Sphinx, don't we? What animal walks on 4 legs in the morning, on 2 legs at noon, and on 3 legs in the evening? Okay, again. Cottrell? She's on her way. Miss Cottrell, Mr. Doer is looking for you. What animal walks on 4 legs in the morning, on 2 legs in the noon, and on 3 legs in the evening? Well, Oedipus is a sharp cat, and he's taken AP English, so he knows how to think in metaphor. And he goes, oh, I totally understand what you're asking me. What you're really talking about is a human being. Because in the morning of a human's life, you crawl on 4 legs. In the noontime of a human's life, you walk on 2 legs. And in the evening of a human's life, you got to get that cane thing that pretty soon Mr. McGee will be using, and that's 3 legs. And immediately the Sphinx goes, dude, you're a pretty sharp cat. And so he leaves. The city of Thebes comes out and says, hurrah, we're saved. Bad news, though, the king, it's been told, the king has died. On the side of the road, he's died. The beautiful wife of the king, her name is Jacusta, comes out and she sees the stunning, handsome, and very bright young man. She says, where are you from? And he says, I'm from Corinth. She says, well, wow, you saved our city. Would you like to marry me and become king of the city? Oedipus is like, whoa, what a day am I having? With the exception of having to kill that old man, this is like a good day for me. Now, what's important about this is that Oedipus doesn't know. If this is a play about a guy who wakes up some morning and says, gee, I think I'd like to kill my dad, marry my mom, and have 4 kids, that's a different kind of play. That is not this play. That is not this play. Let me try to wrap your brain around what this play is. You go off to college, to a town far, far away. You go to a party and you see somebody of the opposite sex that for you is unbelievable. I mean, you guys start talking, you're finishing sentences for each other. It's incredible, stunningly beautiful. You fall in love, you get married, you have 4 kids. One afternoon, a letter arrives that says, surprise, when you were born, you were a twin.
I would.